Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. The fourth and final year of the Civil War was one of the most important and destructive times in all of American history. Ulysses S. Grant took command of all Union armies in March 1864, and 180,000 black soldiers joined the Union Army. In this time period, the South faced almost total destruction with William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea, while at the same time guerrilla war rages in Missouri, all leading up to the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse and the murder of Abraham Lincoln. Today I'm speaking with Sam Gwynne, author of the book Hymns of the Republic, the story of the final year of the American Civil War. There's lots of fresh angles about the war. For example, Robert E. Lee, known as a great general and Southern hero, dealt with frustration, failure, and loss. Ulysses S. Grant, known for his prowess on the battlefield, largely failed in the war, despite winning. His most amazing accomplishments began the moment he stopped fighting. William Tecumseh Sherman was a lousy general, but probably the single most brilliant man in the war, leading to its end. And one of the most important factors of the war was the role of black Union soldiers, many of them former slaves, and interestingly enough, the Confederacy's plan to emancipate its own slaves and form all-black units, which it did, even though these units didn't have much of an effect on the war. In this discussion, we get into some interesting tangents. For example, if Stonewall Jackson hadn't been killed, could the South have potentially won the Civil War, or at least not surrendered, and ended it on its own terms? And also, when does total war work? Sherman's March to the Sea resulted in the wholesale burning of huge parts of the South, and it helped the North win. But when does total war not work? In the examples of Afghanistan, when the Soviets occupied it, or the American war in Vietnam. So we get into the weeds a little bit with our Civil War discussion, but overall there's some really interesting insights at the end of the war. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Sam Gwynne. Samuel, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's good to be talking to you.
All right, well, I have a lot I'm excited to go over with you. First of all, let's begin with a basic point. So the title of your book is Hymns of the Republic. What does that refer to?
Well, it's the direct reference, I guess, would be to Battle Hymn of the Republic, the one that we all know, but that's a single thing. That's a unitary thing. It's a Union song, kind of a bloodthirsty Old Testament biblical Union song. And to me, there are so many other songs in the war. I mean, there's if we're going to take expressions by various people, and I don't mean literal, I mean metaphorical songs. I mean expressions of solidarity, whatever. You have whole groups that are not really represented necessarily by that song, including the entire Confederacy. So I thought, particularly the last year of the war, there are many constituencies, there are many voices here, and I guess that's what I was trying to suggest.
All right. And also I'm curious, because you focus on the last year of the Civil War, what is it that you're trying to contribute uniquely with this focus? Since the Civil War is well-trodden ground, although it has a lot of contemporary interest because many argue that our current issues stem from the aftermath of the Civil War. But what is it with the focus on the last year that you're trying to bring out?
Yes, well, to pick up on the last thing you said, yes, the war has never been more relevant, period. That's fact. And that's why you're hearing a lot about it now. So when I really have always loved the Civil War, and I'd written a biography of Stonewall Jackson, which is essentially about the first 2 years of the war, and I was trying to figure out what to do, and I kind of went back and looked at the original reason why I was interested in the Civil War, and that was a book by a wonderful historian named Bruce Catton, and it was called A Stillness at Appomattox, and it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1953. And it was really about the kind of the last year of the war as seen from the point of view of Grant's army, the Army of the Potomac. But I thought, well, okay, that must have been done about 30 times since then, or 50 or 100 the last year of the war. But no one's really done it, not in a comprehensive way, or not nearly the way Catton did it. And my proposal was to do it. And I felt it was, and to finish the thought, I thought it was so meaningful because the war became so much more desperate, so much more bitter, so much more extreme. There were so many more radical things happening that were determinant of later things. For example, 180,000 black soldiers in the Union Army. At the very end, there were black soldiers in the Confederate Army, which people don't even know about. But there were definitive the guerrilla war in the end of in Missouri and Virginia and Kentucky, Tennessee, and other places. There was so much that I guess was definitive, so much that when the war ended became the definitive thinking about that. And I can keep going on here, and I won't bore you, but that includes the politics and but anyway. So it seemed like a really good lens through which to look at the war, and one again that was the original reason I got interested in the war. I thought, wow, this is really spectacular stuff. Sherman's March to the Sea, and on and on and on. Great stuff.
I'll definitely have to circle back around to Confederate emancipation, which I think is one of the strangest aspects of the war. And I will also want to set things up with Grant and Lee. But before I do so, I need to veer off slightly on a tangent because you're a biographer of Stonewall Jackson. Listeners of the show may have heard a massive 20-plus episode series I did with a co-host on a military history of the Civil War. A question my co-host and I came back to often was it ever possible for the Confederacy to win the war? This Civil War buffs have argued this forever. On the yes column, they'd say, well, if they fought a war of attrition like the Revolutionary War, yes. Those in the nay column say that the fundamentals of industrialization in the North prevented it. But a key point that we came back to a lot was if Stonewall Jackson had not been killed, that would have added a lot of credibility to the yay column. So as a slight tangent, for you as a Stonewall Jackson biographer, had Stonewall Jackson not been killed, what do you think would have happened?
Oh, the Confederacy still loses. I mean, they can't possibly win that war. I mean, there's just no way. What they can do is they can force a negotiation. Now, early in the war, you talked about Britain or France or even Russia doing this, but what the Confederacy was trying to do, particularly in the last year of the war, was to make it so bloody awful, so just costly and bloody and miserable that the North would just come to terms. And of course, if Lincoln had lost that election in 1864, that very likely would have happened. Now, dial back slightly. Jackson died just before Gettysburg. We died after Chancellorsville, but before Gettysburg. I do think Gettysburg would have turned out differently, which would have affected the war, which would have made the North that much sicker of killing and death and all the crap that was going on. And the chances of it really came down to Lincoln, because Lincoln wasn't going along with any of this let's stitch the Union back together nonsense, whether it was in two separate countries or a single country. He wasn't going along with that. But the South had, hope right till the end of a negotiated settlement, because at some point, then it becomes like Vietnam, right? If you win by, or George Washington, you win by not losing. But they never could have won outright. Absolutely no way. They didn't have any. I mean, that wasn't even in the cards. Individual outcomes would have been different. I do think. Well, we could go for hours, as you know, just Gettysburg and what would have happened on day 2 if Jackson had been there, and it really would have been different. There would have been blitzkrieging going on straight through the city and out, and there would have been no Union on high ground. But okay, that's just my own opinion. But anyway, no, the Confederacy did not have the wherewithal to win, but did have the wherewithal to, just make it so awful that the North had to come to a negotiating table somewhere and or vote Lincoln out of office.
All right, well, thank you for handling that big curveball of probably one of the top 3 or 4 alternate history questions of if the South could have won the Civil War, Stonewall Jackson. But back,
the one I get. So Scott, the one just before you go on,
yeah.
But the question I always get every time I speak about Jackson or my book Rebel Yell, it's the Gettysburg question. It's the one question I always get. So, and it's a legitimate question, and God, he made trouble. And when you think of what Jackson and Lee did to the North, I mean, they tied them in knots. But anyway, okay.
That does tie into the next thing, because one of the strands of your book on the final year is Grant and Lee, where you present Lee as a man dealing with frustration and failure and loss. And that becomes more apparent as the war goes on with his weaknesses as a general. And there's been I would say a stronger revisionist account in recent years where they're questioning the myth of him as this great hero who should be among the annals of the great American generals, but he just was battling a losing battle. And then you mentioned that Ulysses S. Grant, who in the final year of the war, he fails in his prowess as a field commander, even though there's a big Grant renaissance now with the Ron Chernow biography and others. So right. What's your take on Grant and Lee in the view of the final year of the war?
So I think I do think Lee was a great commander. I think that, if you parse the career, and one of the things I try to do in my essay on Lee is to parse his career a little bit more closely. I mean, here's a guy who was he did spectacularly well in the Mexican War, but really just had a career as a lifer in the Army. He didn't get promoted much. He was an engineer at these places working on, revetments and forts in New York and in the Mississippi River. I mean, it really wasn't much of a career. Not only that, it wasn't nearly what, if you took Light Horse Harry Lee, not only was he a great hero, he was also a great failure and kind of a lout who fled the country. And so Lee won trying to emulate the father's success, right? And on the other hand, trying to erase the stain of his failure. He was a lifer. And not only that, but he took him, 17 years to get promoted to captain or something. And then he on the verge of the Civil War, he got passed over for a brigadier general by Joseph E. Johnston. He didn't have a great career. It was a competent career, and he was well thought of, and of course he became superintendent of West Point, but that was an appointment that kind of dated from an association that went back to the Mexican War. His early war at places like Cheat Mountain, where he was a failure, straight out failure, and all the nicknames, Granny Lee and Evacuating Lee, and then at 7 days or just before 7 days, King of Spades. All people thought he was a little too fussy for command, maybe, not really the guy. And then, of course, you get to the 7 days, which is what made him famous. It was a disaster on every single level. It was the worst staff work of the war. You couldn't have done it worse, except there was one person in the world who did it worse, and his name was McClellan. And it was a total comedy of errors. Well, not much of a comedy with all that death. Nothing worked for the Confederacy, and yet McClellan was so incompetent and so fearful that you had Lee driving the entire Union army across the York-James Peninsula and into their, virtually into the river where they cowered behind the gunboats, the Federal gunboats. This was a poor performance that made Lee famous. I think what happens with Lee, when you start to see him working with Jackson, you start to see a different guy. The great victories of Chancellorsville, and Fredericksburg didn't take much to win, but Chancellorsville was a great victory. Second Manassas was, there was some serious brilliance operating there. Well, so what I focused on was, I do think Lee was a brilliant commander. I do think that if you look at his career, it's really interesting. He felt frustrated and he never had a happy family life, and he didn't spend much time with his family over all those years. And then you get into the question of his own personal loss. And it's something I'd like to get into with later. I call the Lee paradox. And the Lee paradox is the more Lee wins, the more everything gets destroyed, right? So Lee is a vehicle of destruction of his own country, but not only his own country, he's a vehicle of his own destruction. And meaning he has all these three magnificent estates that came through his wife's family, who are, of course, through the Custis George Washington connection. He loses them all. He loses everything he owns. He loses the slaves that he has, right? He loses all of his money. His family is scattered. At one point, his kid is in a prison camp, and several members of his family are dying. The Christmas of 1864 in Richmond is just miserable, and it's just awful, and they just lost everything. And this great weird irony of, his magnificent mansion in Arlington he was filling it with the Union soldiers that he himself killed. But so the portrait I came up with was, and yes, I would challenge anybody who thinks he's not a military genius. But anyway, at the end, this is a guy has lost everything. and he's about to lose the whole enchilada when he has to surrender. But it's a really interesting, and so I think there's a good deal more depth to him. I think there was a sense that, in particularly the Lost Cause kind of sense, that he was the marble man, the perfect